The year is 1637. A mission building rises in the heart of Edo, its cross catching the morning light. Not a hidden chapel, not a secret gathering, but a cathedral in the shadow of the shogun's own palace. Wooden pews lacquered in red fill with daimyo and samurai who bow their heads in prayer. And outside, thousands of paper lanterns drift up into the night sky, each one bearing a prayer in Latin Japanese. This is not the world we remember. The divergence came in 1612, but the moment itself was small. Tokugawa Ieyasu, already old and calculating, fell gravely ill during the summer monsoon. The physicians could do nothing. Word reached the Jesuit missionaries at Nagasaki, and a young Portuguese priest named João arrived at the shogun's bedside. He offered not just prayers, but a treatment, a distillation of cinchona bark smuggled from the New World. Ieyasu recovered. In the weeks that followed, the shogun sat in quiet conversation with João, the priest translating the gospel into measured Japanese, and Ieyasu, a man who had unified a broken land through strategy and steel, became fascinated by the idea of a single divine truth binding all souls. He did not convert publicly at first, but he lifted the edicts of expulsion. He allowed the missionaries to build, and he waited to see what faith could do. The Tokugawa clan had always understood that power required a shared story. The Buddhists had long served that purpose, but the foreign god offered something new, a chain of loyalty that ran not just to Kyoto, but to a celestial emperor in heaven. And Ieyasu saw the geopolitical advantage too.
By aligning with Christian Europe, Japan could secure Portuguese and Spanish gunpowder, shipbuilding, and navigation techniques. In our timeline, the shogunate feared Christianity as a Trojan horse for colonial conquest. In this world, they adopted it as a diplomatic shield. Within a decade, the transformation began at the top. The shogun himself received baptism in 1616, a private ceremony in the garden of Fushimi Castle. The news spread through the samurai class like wildfire. Conversion became a career move. But here is the unexpected detail. The samurai did not abandon their warrior ethos, they redefined it. The code of Bushido absorbed the language of grace and sin. The sword remained sacred, but now the soul was judged by a different lord. Daimyo built churches on their estates, not as foreign outposts, but as new armories of faith. The Buddhist monasteries were not destroyed. They were reimagined. In Kyoto, the great temple of Kiyomizu-dera added a side chapel dedicated to St. Thomas. The old gods did not vanish. They were folded into the new story. And so Japan evolved along a path no one in Europe predicted. The Jesuits, accustomed to South American resistance, found themselves welcomed not as conquerors but as advisors. The Portuguese ships brought not just Bibles but textbooks on astronomy, medicine, and artillery. The shogunate established a school in Nagasaki where Japanese novices studied Latin alongside martial tactics. By 1650, the first Japanese Jesuit was ordained. His name was Hasakura Tsunanaga, the grandson of a daimyo who had traveled to Rome decades earlier in our timeline.
In this world, Hasakura returned not as a curiosity but as the Archbishop of Osaka. The ground-level story begins in a village called Takayama in the mountains of Hida. A farmer named Matsuo had two sons. The elder Kenji trained as a priest. The younger Taro trained as a carpenter. In 1668, they built a church together in their village square. Kenji said the Mass in Japanese, and Taro carved a statue of the Virgin Mary that wore a kimono, her hair styled in the courtly fashion of Heian period nobility. The local shrine keeper, an old Shinto priest named Yoshi, came to watch. He did not convert, but he left an offering of rice at the foot of the statue. That is the quiet miracle of this timeline, not the wars not won, but the way symbols touched and mixed without erasing each other. By the 1690s, Japan had become the most literate nation on earth. The Catholic emphasis on scripture required every believer to read. The shogunate printed Bibles in mass quantities, but also printed histories, poetry, and treatises on Confucian ethics. The rate of literacy among commoners soared past 60%, higher than anywhere in Europe. And with reading came writing. The first Japanese novel printed on a Gutenberg-style press was a romance called The Pilgrim of Nara, a Christian allegory disguised as a travelogue. It sold 10,000 copies in its first year. Now the geopolitical consequences begin to unfold. Korea watched Japan's alliance with the West with deep unease. In 1685, when the Chinese Ming dynasty fell to the Qing, the shogunate considered an invasion of the Korean peninsula not as conquest, but as a mission to open the hermit kingdom to Christian civilization. It never happened.
The shogun's advisors, many of whom were samurai converts, argued that a war of expansion would contradict the gospel. So instead, Japan sent Jesuit-trained diplomats to Beijing. They brought telescopes and clockwork and asked for trading rights. The Qing, suspicious but pragmatic, agreed to limited exchange. And so Japanese ships began to sail not just east to the Americas, but west to the coasts of India and Africa, carrying lacquerware, firearms, and priests. The Industrial Revolution came a century early to Japan, not through coal and steam, but through wind and tide. The Jesuits had introduced the concept of the mariner's compass and the astrolabe, but Japanese artisans refined them, creating navigation instruments that could be mass-produced in Osaka's workshops. Shipbuilding boomed. By 1720, Edo Harbor held a fleet of ocean-going vessels that rivaled the Dutch East India Company. And the Dutch themselves, who in our timeline were the only Europeans allowed to trade during the isolation period, found themselves marginalized. Japan did not need them as a window. They had their own windows now. The religious transformation deepened in unexpected ways. In 1745, a Japanese theologian named Sugiyama published a radical reinterpretation of the concept of sin. He argued that shame, not guilt, was the true obstacle to grace. This became known as the Edo Doctrine, and it spread through the Christian world. In Rome, the Vatican debated whether to accept it. The debate lasted 50 years, but in Japan, the doctrine took root because it harmonized with the ancient culture of honor. Confession became not a public humiliation, but a private restoration. The church bells rang not to summon the fearful, but to call the hopeful.
And the old religion did not die. Shinto shrines persisted, their torii gates now standing beside church steeples. Families would attend Mass on Sunday and visit the shrine for the new year. It was a syncretism the Jesuits reluctantly accepted because it worked. The number of conversions in Korea and Taiwan, where Japanese traders carried the faith, began to climb. By the end of the 18th century, 1 in 3 East Asians claimed some form of Christian identity, though each culture had woven it into their own cloth. Consider the moment of revelation. In 1790, a Japanese ship landed at Acapulco, carrying an envoy from the shogun. They were met by Spanish officials who expected humble petitioners. Instead, the Japanese ambassador, a samurai in court robes with a crucifix around his neck, presented a treaty of alliance between equals. He spoke fluent Spanish, quoted Aquinas, and offered a gift of a sword with a blade folded 60 times. The Spanish governor was speechless. In our timeline, Japan had closed itself to the world. In this one, it had become the world's most confident hybrid, a nation that had taken a foreign god and made it its own. But not everything was peaceful. The flame of faith, once lit, could burn unevenly. Rural uprisings occurred when local lords enforced baptism too quickly. A backlash movement called the Followers of the Original Way emerged in the 1760s, insisting that the native kami were the true source of life. The shogunate suppressed it, but not with fire. They built a shrine to the kami inside the cathedral at Nagasaki, co-opting the rebellion. Power, as always, found a way to hold.
By the time the 19th century arrived, Japan had established colonies in the Ryukyu Islands and the northern reaches of Ezo, not as conquests, but as protectorates. They built a navy that could sail to Madagascar. They established a seminary in Manila. The great iron ships of Europe never had a reason to force Japan open because Japan had never closed. And so the world we know was changed in a deeper way. The scramble for Africa happened later. The Meiji Restoration never occurred. Instead, a Christian shogunate evolved into a constitutional monarchy in 1868, with an emperor who was both head of state and defender of the faith. Imagine a Tokyo where the imperial palace is flanked by a basilica, where the national anthem is sung in Latin and Japanese, where the prime minister kneels before an altar on the anniversary of Ieyasu's conversion, where the bullet trains carry passengers past roadside shrines and cathedrals in equal number. This is the timeline left behind. A world where isolation was traded for absorption, where a foreign god became the bridge to a maritime empire.